Welcome to Playing with Fire, the podcast for people who are ready to custom build their love.
We're talking about non-monogamy, however you design it, as an individuation opportunity.
Want to leave the default and make your life spectacularly you? You're in the right place. Hey, thanks for listening in, everybody. I'm very into this episode because we're going to talk about men's stuff.
Yeah, this is
We
good.
should talk about men's stuff.
We should talk about men's stuff every once in a while.
Well, we're talking about men's stuff with somebody whose focus is on men's work and men's work around consent specifically. And I hadn't actually thought about the fact that the conversation needs to be taken apart for several years. I remember back when I was first training in sex ed, we were having a pretty consistent conversation around how different genders were responding to the consent conversation differently, and how engaging in that overall dialogue needed to be tailored to the people that we were talking to. And then it feels like we've progressed in that consent conversation and maybe lost that thread.
Yeah, I don't think we
But it's valuable.
It is valuable. I don't think we went far enough along, down the path to stop having the conversation.
Right.
And so
Eric's going to
today we talked with Eric FitzMedrud, and we are going to get into some of that.
Yeah.
And
Eric
what it is.
also specializes in working with people who are polyamorous. So the overlap is awesome. Loving that. Loving the overlap for us, for you all listening. You want to introduce Eric?
I will introduce Eric, and then we will let you listen to what he has to say. Eric FitzMedrud is a therapist specializing in relationship and sexual issues in the San Francisco Bay Area. His specialty is helping men improve their sex lives by learning to regulate emotions, remove sexual entitlement, and hone sexual consent and negotiation skills, which, boy, that's work that needs doing. That's great.
Really good.
He's been published in academic books, presented at conferences, and taught many graduate courses in psychology. He is polyamorous, bisexual, and lives with his wife of 23 years and his life partner of 6 years in San Francisco's East Bay area in California. And I love that positioning. I love that it's coming into this from that position.
Yeah. While we're talking about positioning, let's say we didn't ask for the rest of Eric's positioning, but you can also find him at his website. It's ericfitz.com, isn't it? We'll make sure
Dr. Fitz.
drfitz.com. Yeah. We'll make sure it's linked up. But I wanted everybody to just know Eric does some really cool work. He's got a great website, and he has a recent book out, so you can check that out. We'll make sure it's linked to the notes.
Yeah.
Listen in. So, Eric, welcome so vigorously. A vigorous welcome. Thank you for coming and for talking about a topic that I think everybody has heard about, but we don't get into nuanced conversations about it. Talking about consent, like, great buzzword. But then, and then what? What's the actual conversation? So thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I know in our introduction, we already said that you wrote a book. Would you just start us off by telling us what the book was for? Like, why, what, usually a book comes out because it needs to. What inspired you?
So I think there were really two kinds of threads of development that led me to writing it. The most kind of general one that other people are going to relate to is that during the Me Too movement in late 2017, I was watching, all of the big headline stories coming through, predators finally being held accountable. And I was witnessing in my clinical practice from the beginning, not the predatory kinds of consent violations, but I was like, gosh, there's a through thread in our culture here, an absence of training around consent that is damaging a lot of relationships. And as much as I love this important conversation about holding the powerful accountable, holding predators accountable, I was really longing for the conversation that would be more on the ground of people who weren't wanting to violate consent, who weren't trying to violate consent, who were horrified to find out that they had made a partner feel uncomfortable or feel violated. and also not having the training, the skill, or, the language to do better. And when the Aziz Ansari story came out in that process about, story that came out in babe.net where the language that was used in the story was assault. And there was a big conversation about whether it was actually or not. And yet everybody could recognize that was not skillful consent. And lots of people who partner with men had the experience of like, gosh, even if I don't think that was necessarily assault, I've had that experience and it's not good.
Yeah.
Um, and that was the one that crystallized for me. I could say something about this because now that story is close enough to what I actually witnessed in my office. And I started writing a blog post, and then it just got bigger and bigger. And I realized that I was writing a book and
Mm.
started wishing that something smaller and easier to write had picked me.
Oh, okay. That makes total sense. And I'm
Yeah.
glad you decided to answer the call anyways.
Yeah. I don't think there was much of a choice in a way.
I really appreciate that that you're naming the the elephant in the room, that there are gradations of like consent. We would love if it were as simple as this or that, and we could just all see at face value exactly where the lines are around every topic.
Right.
And it's just not that simple, especially once you add in the fact that we humans are not great at using the technology of language to convey everything we mean. And then we have all these wounds that stop us from
Yeah.
actually
On all
conversing
sides of
anymore.
the consent conversation,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
In the asking and in the boundary holding. And also then the same two people in the opposite direction, right? The person who was holding a boundary also wanting something, and the other person who was wanting something also holding their boundary. So
Yeah.
it gets complicated sometimes.
Yeah, it gets complicated, and I appreciate that your approach to the topic is, that assault isn't the bar. Like,
Right.
we don't need to wait until assault occurs, until something is characterized as assault, in order to pay attention to the
Yes.
topic. There's a lot of other levels of complexity in human relationships, and yeah, I like that you're like, okay, so let's see what's going on here. What can we do?
I- In fact, influenced by some of the conversations that I've been having with other consent teachers and educators, I've really begun talking about sexual assault as the low bar consent. And high bar consent is about pleasure, is about ecstasy, is about opening up all of the erotic pathways. And yeah, I think that there's a lot more likelihood that if we aim for the high bar, we're going to clear that low bar much more easily.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
that's
makes
key.
sense.
And it makes perfect sense to me that this conversation, so you wrote your book aimed at men. I mean,
Yeah.
the title gives it away.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear that like consent conversations aren't just about men, but you aimed this book. And so this conversation, we're going to steer right into that. Like
Yes.
men definitely have, and let's be clear, especially cisgender men, men who have passing privilege as cisgender men, right? Like if you're a trans man with passing privilege, some of this may apply to you as well.
Absolutely.
There's some impact that's happening. I'm seeing in my own practice around feeling terror, feeling so much fear around the conversation of consent that I feel like people sort of rush through even discussing it because it's scary to consider where we have not been really seeking and providing consent, where we have not provided consent as well. So then we can get defensive and get caught in our own stories of like, well, hey, if we're going to be talking about consent here, I have not had consent in many of my own experiences. And I'm glad you're talking directly to men. I really am. And I
Yeah.
just want to, preface everything that comes after this point as like, yep, and we're all in this together, all genders in this conversation
Absolutely.
together.
I mean, I've had people of other genders read the book and also say that they learned things about consent, that they learned things about men's experience that was helpful. But I wanted to respond to a particular gap, I think, in the cultural lexicon and the cultural sexual education that has left men with that fear that you're talking about. This experience that a lot of men have of, I have love in my heart, I have desire in my body, I want to be a good man. I want my partners to experience me as loving and desirous in the very best ways. But I don't have the language. I don't have an understanding of my own desire. I don't have a pathway to follow so that I know how to do this. I know the goal I want to reach. I know how I want my partners to feel. I know how I want to open up and deliver my love and desire, but I haven't been taught how to go from, you know, this is someone I'd like to do some of those things with, all the way to, the consent conversations, the behaviors, and then the follow up and the learning and the lessons and the incorporation. And it's so important that we fill that gap because I think, you know, the broad story about men that gets told about sexuality is, as David Lay says, if somebody's talking about a man's sexuality, he did something wrong. We
Yeah.
don't often talk about the joyful, exuberant, intense, loving, affirming nature of men's desire. And partly that's because we don't have these vibrant pathways through which it can flow.
Yeah.
And so I hope that by teaching men that their sexuality is good, that they are needed, that their love is not wrong, that their desire is not bad, dirty, or wrong, and then help them build up their own capacity to learn how to understand that desire, how to regulate that desire and their other emotions, how to fill their need for human connection, that they will be more skillful in delivering and also receiving love and attention.
Mm.
I like that. Inherent in all of that is at least I see it as, um, you seem to have this vision that there's a way that men can take their place in the community beyond the boxes that the culture has defined, in
Absolutely.
whichever culture you happen to be in. And that brings me to a question that I'm curious to get your take on.
Yeah.
And I don't know entirely how to answer this question myself, but your book targets men. We're talking about men with this constant conversation about the evolution of the concept of gender. How do you define a man? Like, how do you decide who that audience even is?
Yeah. I don't.
Perfect. I love that answer so much.
Says my gender nonconforming husband person, right? Like,
Yeah. I mean, the way that I invite my audience in is that I say that I'm speaking to self-identified men. So if you self-identify as a man, I think that at least on some level, you are identifying that some part of your experience, of your mode of being, your way, or the way that you would like to move through the world fits some part of what you see in other people who also self-identify as men.
Oh, good. I like that. Yeah.
And I think that it's so important actually for the healing of all men, including cisgender men, including heterosexual men, that we really recognize and welcome the broad and diverse nature of who will come to us identifying as men. When we accept all shapes, sizes, forms, and identities of men, including people who are non-binary, sometimes men, that creates a much bigger space for all of our different and diverse manhoods to exist, even if we are cisgender, even if we are heterosexual. If that man exists, I'm safer here no matter what my manhood looks like.
mm. Well, my nervous system just regulated a little bit
Yeah.
hearing the two of you
Right.
talk
Right.
about gender that way as two people who like have a lot of masculine privilege. I can just looking at
Yeah.
the two of you, like,
Yeah.
yep, there you go. You move through the world with the privilege piece, which also means you have to learn how to move with the accountability piece.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I wonder if right now we could shift gears a little bit and talk about some practicalities. And then I want to come back to this piece because I want to ask you something about jealousy and all of this. But practically speaking, like, what are you finding people need? Like, what do men need to know right now about consent that can help them make little shifts immediately?
Yeah, the big one that I find really begins to shift men's approach to consent is beginning to realize that sexual behavior is not a need. And when when I start talking with men about that, and they begin talking about, but it feels that way, then we begin sifting out the things that are a need and the things that aren't. You do need human connection. You probably even need humanizing touch, but you don't need sexual behavior, and you certainly don't need specific sexual behaviors from any specific other person. And this really kind of reforms the responsibilities for the men to think about, how can I be a vibrant sexual being on my own? How can I take responsibility for the expression of my sexuality on my own, including masturbation, including full body pleasure, including humanizing my own relationship with my body so that I am responsible for feeling good in here?
Mm.
And then how can I build a diverse relationship with the community of other people, including maybe other men, where I get the touch, where I get the validation of my emotions, where I get the support for my human existence and the difficulties and the pains of it, so that when I get into a loving relationship or a sexual relationship or a relationship that is both, I'm not compacting all of my needs for human connection into one person and then also into one type of experience in the bedroom with that one person. Because that's why I think it ends up feeling to so many men like sex is a need, because they've
Mm.
compacted all of their needs for humanizing human connection into sex with their partners.
Oh. So when I had a full embodied response to the sentence. So as a cisgender woman, um, I had a full body response to sex is not a need. And my response was like, "Oh, hang on, stop. I don't want you to say that," because I remember pushing so hard from my place of supposedly not being a person
Right,
who was supposed to want sex, right? I remember
right.
a great liberation that came with like, "Hey, I get to say I need this." But I hear you making an incredibly nuanced statement about, wait, but there are more basic, essential factors that sex can provide
Yeah.
Right.
for, and those are the real needs. And that also opens up to what happens as our bodies change and we no longer necessarily can do the same things. That could also open up space around, how do I meet these essential needs, these truly essential needs?
Right. Sex may be one way,
Yeah.
whatever you may think sex is, it may
Yeah.
be one way of meeting this other need.
Right.
But like you're
But
saying, as age and whatever other experiences influence what sex is for you, you may need to go look at other things to get that need met. But the sex might just be one piece.
And
Yeah.
so how interesting, like from a depth psychological perspective, I'm now thinking about um how interesting it is that we've made a defensible position around sex being a need and sex not being a need. Like I could get defensive from either position. From if my partner wants less, if my partner wants more, I can easily find lots of validation out in the culture, including psychological theory, including sexuality theory, right? I could find validation for that position and feel safe in my stance that whatever it is I'm saying I need is what I need, right? We've started talking about needs and like they're basic. And then that gets us close to, do we have this drive? And I hear you acknowledging that sex isn't a drive, which
Right.
as a sex educator, I'm down with, but I think that is still how people talk about sex, which is
Phrase sex drive is still used.
right.
Right. Right. And when we're talking about sex is not a drive, a part of what we're talking about is you will not become ill from
Right.
not having
Right.
sex.
Right.
There is no part of your body that will grow sick from not having sexual behavior with another person.
Unlike abstaining from, say, water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a drive.
Yeah.
Right. And there can also be what we might refer to as emotional needs, these desires for fulfillment that we want to lean towards, that are how we want to express ourselves. And it's okay for us to want that. It's okay for us to insist that we have that in our relationship. But to be clear that no one else owes that to us helps to dissolve the entitlement around the conversation that we have with our partner about that. This is something I seek. This is something I want in my relationship. Are you down for that? Will you join me in that?
Right.
It's not automatic. It's not a given. It's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee forever and throughout the entire lifespan. And now the conversation shifts entirely to this is what I'm looking for. What are you looking for? And, before we're even getting in the bedroom, we're talking about having a consent-based conversation about the foundational elements of what we're in relationship for, or maybe reevaluating the foundations of our relationship agreements.
Now we're in trouble.
Reevaluating. Yeah.
No, now we're in big trouble because one of the foundational premises I see people show up with, and I'm
Yeah.
guessing you see this all the time, is we don't talk about that. We don't talk, like, we can't get to a sexual consent conversation because, in fact, we
Right.
don't have, we actually can, I promise you can.
Yeah.
But we do not have that kind of conversation. I'm looking at you, Hamilton. In Ken's first marriage, and he's talked about this on the podcast a lot, he was not like, it's not that either one of them was wrong. They did not have these conversations.
Well, and
So
as you were talking, Eric, I was hearing something that made me think apparently about that exact set of things, which is right. So we could have a consent conversation of, and what did you say? You said, I want this. Do you want this too? The ability to ask that question is predicated on the ability to withstand the answer no, and
Yes.
know what how the relationship is going to develop from there.
Which
And
is
if
why
you're like, no, I'm too scared, I need this relationship to, I have told myself that the continuation of this relationship is paramount, and
yes.
asking the question
Yes.
may deviate from that, I will not have a consent conversation. A joy as a no. So yes,
Which is
this was
And
what
that's
I
why
did.
in my book, I build up toward the consent conversations, right? I need to know that I have firm connections with other people, a vibrant and independent life. I need to have the capacity to regulate my emotions, including the negative emotional experiences of rejection, sadness, grief, disappointment, because that enables me to feel confident enough that, gosh, I am scared about what the answer to this question is going to be. But I am also confident that if I get a negative answer, an answer that I don't want to hear, I can handle it.
yeah.
And yeah, so I'm experiencing a collection of things right now, one of which is that as a socialized man,
Yeah.
I'm told that I'm supposed to be able to withstand anything, but apparently accept emotions. Right, because in this moment of fear, all of the super cisgender man stuff that I've been handed says I can walk through any experience and be fine. But if somebody threatens this relationship that I have put so much importance into, all of a sudden, I'm a testicle. Don't touch me. I'm very fragile. Help me. Help. Nope. Nope.
Right.
Don't bother me. All of a
Right.
sudden, all of that training that I'm supposed to be so strong just doesn't apply. And it's
Well,
really interesting.
and I really look at that as the exact same function as being tossed into any skill or any task where we do not have even the foundational skills to attend to it. We give up on tasks that we don't have any idea of how to approach.
Oh, that's really good.
And so, the book begins exactly with acknowledging those wounds of being socialized as men, not just the absence of emotional vocabulary, not just those scripts of men are supposed to be this, but also the enforcement of those norms. If we cried as a boy on the Little League field, if we were sad that we did poorly on a test and other people witnessed it, very often the impact that we got from adults, from other peers of multiple genders is some kind of violent derision, insult to us and our maleness. So those norms were not just taught externally, but they were violently and socially imposed, including with ostracization isolation. And that means that we fear when we come up to those emotions, that if they show, it will not go well for us and we will lose connection. We will lose our visible manhood. And that will mean that we will lose our pathway to connection.
Hmm. Heartbreaking to conceive of from out here. But I just want to acknowledge that the two of you are having this conversation from the inside of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm just witnessing.
And
So thank
I
you.
see in that too, right, if my visible manhood doesn't match up, then I expect that my ability to connect will be reduced. And
Yeah.
built into that is the social priority of manhood, of masculinity over femininity. So if I express myself in ways that are traditionally more feminine, I won't be able to connect. Women connect all over the place,
Right.
but somehow there's this story. So now we're hooked into the patriarchy and misogyny and all those kinds of things.
And the contract of patriarchy, which is I'm going to fulfill this role and I expect back these things from others. And one of the things I say very clearly in my book is women have moved on from that contract. And a lot of men and the community of men have not. And it's really time for us to reckon with the fact that us continuing to play out or expect that contract is now really leading to an epidemic of loneliness for us. This is the experience that we are able to talk about now. And if we internalize that as responsibility for us to free ourselves from, we could be free from it instantly, right? If every lonely man reached out
Right.
to all of the other lonely men, we would have vibrant and loving communities of men that are rich.
Right. Yeah.
Problem solved.
Yeah.
And yet, we're not seeing that happen overnight. There's an increasing conversation about it, but I notice how it's much easier to talk about. So I have men still seeking out my help, whether that is in a professional relationship or in a
Right.
personal relationship. I mean, I date quite a lot, and I date quite a lot of cisgender men, and I can tell at this point when, oh, I know what role, I know what role they're really seeking. In case anybody's listening and wondering if the women in your life can tell that they're playing a role rather than being seen, they can, and they don't like it. And they might be putting up with it, but they don't like it. It's not actually getting you closer to your real needs being met, those deeper needs we're talking about. It's not. And the reason we can is because we became, as a group, collectively, obviously, individuals, we became attuned to noticing when we're in these implicit obligations. And now, like you said, we don't want to be part of that contract anymore.
And that was both by socialization, but also by enforcement, right? Because a
Right.
man who wasn't experiencing the roles around him the way that he expected became a fragile man and sometimes then a dangerous man.
Yeah. I may have known a few of those. I think that this conversation between men is beautiful. And there's another question that I know that you had that I think it's an interesting question for the two of you specifically, because of your identities, because of your held identities to answer, which is you mention in your book that there's this importance for men to not just accept, but embrace sexual diversity, right? So why does that matter? Like, so we know that cisgender, straight, heterosexual, monogamous, vanilla, like that still is the majority of people, even though in my personal world it does not feel like that. But we know it's the majority. Why is it important for them to accept and embrace and even enthusiastically support in different ways, if not engage in, sexual diversity?
So, because no man can ever live up to the two-dimensional image of what men are supposed to be. We all have other emotions that are vulnerable. We all age. We all grow weak. We all need connection and support at different times of our lives. So, whether we're talking about those sexual diversities, those identity or relational diversities or not, the image of this idea of a man is XYZ is false. I mean, we could just look at the internally inconsistent notions of what men are supposed to be, right? He's supposed to be an entrepreneur who, is in business and a CEO. He's supposed to work with cars and go hunting. The overlap between those two images of only the right men are, is very small.
Yeah.
And so every man ends up having some image of manhood that he ends up feeling he doesn't live up to. So the more safety for all of the diversity of men, the more safety for even the het, cis, vanilla, monogamous man who still in some way and or at some time in his life will deviate from that norm.
Yeah,
Because the myth that there isn't diversity
Right,
is what's in
exactly.
the way of that. Yeah, that
Right.
media myth that there
Right.
is that the media majority,
yeah.
which
Right.
doesn't exist, that doesn't reflect the actual complexity of us.
And then just take a look at the inner experience too of, diversity among men's experiences of how their penises work in terms of erectile function, whether it's early in a relationship or late in a relationship, or how that changes over lifespan. When we impose this monolithic norm on ourselves, when we expect that the only good men are men with a ready erect penis exactly when I want, how long I want, and that only ejaculates when I want, no man is ever going to live up to that.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't matter what the identity is. We are all safer when we recognize the diversity among men, that men without penises can still be excellent and exceptional lovers. Then we can decentralize the penis as the only way to be good as a lover.
Hell yeah. Like, yeah, yes.
Let's
Yeah,
do that.
right.
Let's decentralize that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're bisexual and polyamorous, and
I
you're
am.
you're out. I appreciate that you write your book with your positionality up front. I appreciate that very much. And Ken is also
I
out
too
here
am out
and
as bisexual and
and
polyamorous.
kinky. So
Yeah, me too.
there's a lot of shared identities. How did all of those, like, I mean, I know you can't sum this up, but what would you say all of those diversities within yourself have done to help you be in this place and stand here and have this conversation that, like you said, it's a pretty heavy burden to carry this conversation to a broader population? How has that impacted it? Has it been hard or easier or?
So for me as a bisexual man, I think that's the identity that I kind of lean on the most in this conversation, and that I think helps me the most. And I think if in a way I see bisexuality as almost like my gender identity, um, because I do feel sometimes like there's a capacity that comes with my bisexuality of hearing and understanding the different experiences, knowing in my being different ways of being, different ways of showing up. In my kink identity, I'm also a switch, so I can be dominant and submissive. And so that back and forth lens of I understand what it's like to be the high desire partner. I understand what it's like to be the low desire partner. I understand what it's like to be the larger physical bodied person. I understand what it's like to be the smaller physical bodied person. And that just gives me, I think, a different way of speaking about this because the different parts of me that I have had to integrate had to learn how to speak to each other. And so that's hopefully the compassionate voice that I bring to men having one side of that experience too.
Well, that's nice to hear. And your acknowledgement of your internal complexity. So, well, it comes through in the book for one thing, because that multiple perspective, it brings multiple messages out, and that's so important for moving us away from that monolithic way to be a man.
Yeah.
Which we need that. And isolation has come up in you mentioned it, I've seen you mention it online and things about, the lone wolf and how, lone wolves die, because they do.
The metaphors aren't
The
good.
metaphors aren't good.
The metaphors are good.
And there are so many things. My mind, actually, I had a hold of like 7 different things you said that link to the isolationism that is imposed and enforced on men, women too. That is not
Well,
specific
especially
to
as
men.
when we choose to adhere to the patriarchal
Yep.
standard, right? Like then
Right.
we're invited into, oh, we could choose this horrible adventure. It's a choose your own adventure. There are many horrible choices to
Which
make.
one do you want? And then backing up a level, completely gender irrelevant. The culture is isolating. It's
Yes.
designed to isolate us as humans from each
Yes.
other, independent of whatever gender you're currently working with. And so it all links in so much. And so your very first comment about so you don't define what a man is, self-identified, and is in context. It's in social context, in reference to the people around us. And to the extent that we isolate ourselves from our own experience of ourselves.
Right.
Right. If there's no
Yikes.
context, then how do I know myself? And I talk about that all the time. Like Jung says, like there is no self other than the self in community, because that's where I find out where my edges are.
And where
And
my
hopefully
potentials
consensually.
become activated. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But in order to do that in a consensual way, I have to be willing to leave the cave and the metaphor of the cave, like not just the physical cave. A lot of people are like out and they're busy, but that's not the same thing as connecting. And then I need to actually be willing to engage in
I'm
these.
right here.
He's the thing. And then we have to engage in these uncomfortable realities,
Yeah.
which may be, oh, I'm creating my own isolation. I am reinforcing it. Like it is brought to me and handed to me, no problem. But then I reinforce it. And what do I do to manage that, to work against it, to work in my own favor and in the favor of all of the men around me, all the humans around me.
And it does take effort, like you were alluding to, Ken, is the culture imposes this isolation in, an equitable way across everyone. It takes a lot of effort for us to push against that stream and create real human connection. One of the reasons that I love working around issues of sexuality, sexual identity, gender identity, is that when we become an authentic human, when we know who and what we are, it creates much more opportunity for real human connection. Not that we can only connect with people that share those identities, but we have something real that can connect then.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is who I am. This is how I move through the world.
Right.
Right. That two-dimensional figure does not. There's no connection point. It's quite literally flat and connectionless.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Because I see the clock and I see time running out, and I really wanted to. So polyamory is or non-monogamy as a larger umbrella is the constant conversation here at Playing with Fire. And my personal academic conversation is around jealousy. And I was thinking about how the ways that men are socialized and the ways that they are unfortunately put into a context where it is really easy to skip having these consent conversations. It does seem like this has an impact on men's experience of jealousy. And I've done data collection on women, men, and non-binary individuals and jealousy. And only the women's study has come out so far because the men are so resistant to showing up for their interviews that it took 7 times as long to collect their interviews. So
Yeah.
that alone, I feel like the anecdotal piece of that is, well, that since it went out to a generalized population, that's information all in its own. But I'm curious what you think. So in non-monogamy, we know we're opening the door to potential jealousy. We're all opening the door to jealousy, but explicitly in non-monogamy,
Yeah.
there it is. How do you see the like all the things you talk about as intersecting with jealousy and how it's handled?
So, going back to the two-dimensional idea of what a man is, he is judged by his successes and by his accumulations. And in that patriarchal model of masculinity, one of those accumulations is his partner and the inference or story of his sexual prowess, including especially penis length and size. Um, and so, in non monogamous situations or other situations where the narrative of a man's um, sexual accumulation, his ownership over or dominion over his partner gets threatened. His partner cheated on him. She found better orgasms with somebody else or a woman or whatever. Now, that is not just a story about what his partner did and um, their choices in their monogamous relationship. In his narrative or in the patriarchal narrative of that man's self and worth, he is judged as deficient.
Mm,
And so his jealousy shows up as a way of reinforcing the false notion that he could control somebody else in order to maintain his worth in his own eyes and in the eyes of his community.
mm,
And when men open up and realize, first of all, my accumulation doesn't tell the story of my worth as a human being. Also, I have real, vibrant human connection that is going to understand that I have done what I can to be a loving and kind partner. And also, I have human failings, and that might be a part of this story. And also, my partner is their own human being with their own failings, and that might be a part of this story. Now I can accept the nuance here, including my powerlessness,
mm,
that I cannot control another human being. I can't control their desire. I can't control whether another person is a better lover for them or not. All that I can control is trying to show up as the best partner I can be, the best lover I can be. And that includes necessarily a degree of humility about maybe I have things to learn that is very antithetical again to the
mm.
two-dimensional notion of men as competent doers who just know what to do. They take it and that all works every time,
Every time.
infallibly.
Every time.
So I hear a general theme that if men can allow themselves to be in a place of ongoing learning and transformation and truly show up for themselves as they are, that there is hope for so much richer experience of their relating, their sex, their relationships like
Yeah,
as they exist.
you can, it takes so much less energy to be an honest, authentic human being than to continue trying to pretend to be something that was imposed on you.
Yeah. So I want to name one more piece connected to jealousy then, because I'm super curious if you've seen this. Because there's another extreme to this. So on the one hand, I see um men who really, really struggle with jealousy. It's big, it's overwhelming to them. And in fact, uh, they struggle to talk about it even. Like I have struggled
Mhm.
to get them in the door to talk about it. But we see it because, I mean, we have studies that show that 74% of domestic violence cases have jealousy somewhere in their root, right? So the data is already there. We're just not talking about it. But I see a flip side, and I'm not entirely sure how to help men other than to open up this conversation that then there are the evolved men we could put a trademark after that, evolved man who doesn't feel jealousy and who just is 100% confused about why jealousy would ever be a problem, why you wouldn't just whatever, insert whatever intellectualization, whatever obfuscation or escape or isolate or like cutting themselves off from that. There's a million ways that we can disavow any jealousy. And I want to be careful because I know that there are people in the world, Ken is one of them, who experiences like a high tolerance for the other, the third, right? It tends not to set off his alarm bells, right? So he's low jealousy because he's high threshold for that. But then there are a lot of people who are showing up in my conversations where they just don't appear to do anything other than intellectualize about jealousy. And then they get frustrated with their partners and their experience of jealousy.
Yeah. Ken, you may help validate some of my impression of this, but I think that when we have an emotional attachment and connection, especially when there is a commitment to another person, there is always the potential for jealousy, because one manifestation of jealousy is just, I perceive a risk to what is here. I perceive a risk to this attachment or this commitment, and that shows up for me as the insecurity or as the alarm bells going off as the externals are encroaching on that territory. It may be real, it may not be. But when you say there are men who are, the evolved man, trademarked, who say, I feel nothing, the first inquiry I would have about that is, but do you also have emotional connection, attachment, and real authentic vulnerability?
Yeah.
Because the image of detachment might create the image of a lack of jealousy.
Right.
And I've also seen a number of those men who suddenly get into a game-changing relationship and over their head. And usually they end up coming to me because of ejaculation problems, like very quick ejaculation, because now their heart's connected and it's just overwhelming.
Yep.
Premature ejaculation. And suddenly they're experiencing feelings and attachment in a way they weren't before. Does that match your experience to a degree, Ken?
Yeah. What I hear is right. So the threat response, I apparently have a low threat response to other people.
That's my
and
experience
some
of
people
you.
have a higher threat response. And it's like some people pick a slightly different version of that two-dimensional presentation. This one doesn't have jealousy in it. This one has violent jealousy in it. Like there's this menu to pick from, and one of them is the stoic.
Yeah.
Nope, that doesn't bother me. Nothing bothers me. This is just one of the things that doesn't bother me. Yeah. So there's so many different ways to accept the models that are presented to us.
I wonder if this is why this is such a challenging conversation. I can think of a few men who I would love to listen to this episode, and I hope they are, and I'm crossing my fingers right now. And they may not identify with that two-dimensional man. They're like, no, I'm doing my work. I am. But I, as a professional, see them and I'm like, I know, but right now, what I'm seeing is, yeah, you've picked one of a few scripts, but it's a very few set. It's a very narrow range. And so maybe that is part of what's happening, where we are getting into some more complexity. We're starting to see, oh, but there's also, yeah, like you said, there's the CEO bro, right? You can choose that. You could also choose the hunter. You can and both are valid, right? And the stoic is another valid option amongst that two-dimensional like range. It's a really narrow range, but like it's like you have to literally pick up the script and it has to fit on an index card. Yeah. And I want a whole book. I want personality. Yeah, right. I want a man with a whole novel behind him.
Right.
Because I know that that's in there. But if they don't have access to that themselves because they don't realize that they can.
And so you just presented a picture of the potential for complexity, potential for multiplicity. And what we have been talking about is explicitly in opposition to that. It's the idea that this is me, this is it, this is the whole thing right here, and it doesn't change.
Right. That myth that men are this,
just like your cock never changes.
Right. Yeah. Oh, by the way, that is my cock. because it's intentionally conflated.
Right.
Right.
So right, and it never changes, except it does. And the idea that I am stoic really all the time, every minute of every day, you never change. Of course you do. Everything, like, we go up and down, we get hungry, so we change what we're doing. But the idea of specifically for men is this is you all the time, all the time.
Mm.
Mhm.
And so jealousy may come up and you're like, nope, no, I do my work, so this isn't a problem, until the situation comes up that is different from all the things that you had planned.
Mhm.
And now you're in a new situation, and suddenly part of you is like, that work doesn't matter right now. This is really, I am so activated right now. And all of a sudden you behave differently.
Right.
Right. And then if you haven't developed the skills for tolerating vulnerability, right, that quote unquote evolved man suddenly reverts back
Yeah.
to the hyper-patriarchal script because he leapt over the phases of real emotional vulnerability development from, well, I'm not going to do that. Maybe in an allergy, I am going to do this. I'm the, um, tantra,
Yep.
sensitive, I've evolved past jealousy. And suddenly he's manifesting this script that very much contradicts that external or maybe even internal image he had of himself.
Yeah. Okay. So now we are going to wrap up, but I'm having you back because we need to talk more about jealousy. I'm very like,
There's
we
a
could
lot
go,
to go
we could
into here.
definitely
Yeah.
dive into this. And I feel like men do deserve a specific conversation about jealousy. And that's what's showing up in my work over and over again right now is, oh, y'all need a very explicit and specific conversation that includes multidimensionality and addresses the fact that these scripts are they're hurting you and hurting you specifically if you're trying to do non-monogamy and you're running
Yeah.
up against either extreme with jealousy. It's just so painful and damaging.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about one penis policies, right?
Oh,
Right.
no.
Okay.
Right? There's so
So-
much to talk about.
Okay. So a can is open. The worms are everywhere. And we're going to wrap up anyways. As we wrap up, what is the one thing you would like to leave all people with about men and masculinity?
Men are human people. We are
Mhm.
diverse. We have hurts, we have loves, and like all human people, we are good and beautiful, and we struggle in this process too of being in relationship.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
Lovely. Thank you, Eric.
Really can't thank you enough for this conversation. Where can people find you?
I'm
They
available
need to
on
find
all, yeah, I'm available on all social media at Dr. Eric Fitz, DrEricFitz, and that's also the URL for my website, drericfitz.com.
Excellent. And all those links will be in the show notes, and as will links to your book. I'm so, so excited for people to be entering into this conversation in a more nuanced way. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having
Thank
me.
you. And thank you for your work.
I appreciate it. Thank you for yours.
There's no one right way to design your relationship. And lots of people, actually about 25%, according to a recent national survey, are interested in some type of open relationship. But how do you know if you are ready to open up happily? Not everyone is, and that's no problem. I've got a 60-second quiz that will give you the answer. And even better, you'll walk away with your next step, whether you're good to go or not so much when it comes to opening up. And this is no BuzzFeed nonsense. I personally designed this quiz from my years of academic research. Go to joliequiz.com. That's JOLIQUIZ.com and find out if you're ready to open up happily and what to do if you are or if you're not.